Hello and welcome to, oh, yes, that was take 10. No, it wasn't. Hello and welcome to Reiki Women Podcasts. And it's Bronwen Logan here. That's me. And I'm from Reiki with Bronwen. And with me, as always, I have the lovely Carrie Varela. Hi, Carrie. From the Reiki Healing Society, and Michaela Daystar from Heartscapes Reiki. Hi, Michaela. And today we're going to talk about something that I think that possibly Americans consider to be uniquely American, although I live in Australia. We have our own history of this same thing. Just on a bit of a different scale, possibly. But it's about the Japanese incarceration during World War II. And yesterday, I think it was in America, it was the day of remembrance for that. So we thought, because we often talk about cultural appropriation and actually the influence of the Japanese aspects of the system into the system of Reiki, we talk about this, we can see where, for example, a lot of the Japanese aspects were taken out. And I think from today's discussion, we'll probably be able to work out why that might be so. So I'm going to hand you over to our history buff. That is Michaela Daystar. She's going to give us a bit of a rundown on it all. And then we're going to have a little bit of a chat together about what it means to us and our practice. Yep. Welcome, Michaela.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm so glad we get to have this conversation. As of recording this today in America is February 19th, which is the Day of Remembrance for the Japanese incarceration during World War II, as Bronwen said. And it's the sort of thing that, oftentimes history can feel very, very far away, and we can fail to recognize the ways that significant moments in history are still impacting our lives to this day. Really, World War II was only 2 generations away. My grandfather was a naval officer in World War II, so I definitely grew up with the influence of that time in my life. And as I step into the world of Reiki more and more deeply, I can really feel that influence here inside of our community of Reiki. So I wanted to just start by sharing a little bit of history, giving the context of this day, why we are marking this day, and what that means for those of us in the Reiki community, particularly those of us who are white identified, who are American, or who are otherwise connected to this history. So our story begins in December of 1941, when the Japanese military bombed the military base in Pearl Harbor in the occupied territory of Hawaii, the US base there. And that event, as many people know, really ushered in the United States to join the war. It was what was kind of the final straw that caused us to jump into this conflict and ultimately really change the tide of that war altogether. A couple of months later, in February 19th of 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. And this order was deemed a military necessity, quote unquote, and to basically round up and incarcerate anybody who, quote, looked like the enemy. That included, of course, military combatants, people who were, actually involved in the military, Japanese nationals who were captured. But significantly, it also included up to and over 120,000 US citizens of Japanese descent, over 2/3 of which were people who were born and raised right here, had little to no direct connection to Japan, considered themselves born and raised Americans, and of course, not only were subjugated to their civil rights being taken away, to being literally thrown into concentration camps, their property seized and redistributed, but also the psychological blow of essentially having their citizenship stripped from them simply because of their heritage. This was a significant human rights violation that a couple of decades after the war ended, we began to acknowledge as a nation. And ultimately that led to marking this day as the Day of Remembrance. It also led to reparations bills that reimbursed a tiny percentage of the wealth and property and land that was seized from the families that were impacted. There's also the generational trauma of experiencing that, again, just 2 generations ago, that stays with people of Japanese descent in our country. And that flares up in, for example, during the pandemic year, there was a lot of anti-Asian violence, and those families were resubjected. So it's something that definitely is still in the air. So the question then becomes, what does this have to do with the system of Reiki? It has a lot to do with the system of Reiki, because as it turns out, it was exactly at this time that Hawaii Takata had brought the system of Reiki into Hawaii. Again, an occupied territory at the time, would become a state about a decade later. And just prior to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, maybe a couple of years at the most, Takata was beginning to teach, was setting up a community of practitioners in Hawaii. She was a Japanese descended Hawaiian woman, and we all know bits and pieces, at least, of the story of Takata becoming ill and going to Japan to seek medical treatment, meeting Chijiro Hayashi, being treated at his Reiki clinics in Japan, having what she decided was a miraculous healing, and taking Reiki on as her life's passion from then on. So right around this time that World War II was brewing up, that Japan and the United States were squaring off with each other as enemies, this practice that we love so dearly, that's so connected to our life and to the lives of many of you listening, was taking root in the Western world, at least in the gateway to the Western world, and was significantly impacted by these events. On a very personal level, Chijiro Hayashi was a naval officer in the Japanese military. He was pressured to spy on the communities in Hawaii because he had this access. He was traveling here to help support Takata and her community. And, he was expected to use that access as a way of gaining military information. And he refused to do that. And ultimately, he ended up taking his own life, because as a military doctor, he had very few options at that time: conform or face the consequences. And so there's this, these layers of history, but also these layers of trauma that come in when we look at a sacrifice like that. And we look at this paradox of this, taking root of this beautiful practice that we all love so much, and death and trauma and violence and the taking away of civil rights at that time happening all at the same time. And as Bronwen alluded, that led to some choices that Takata and her community had to make, because I would imagine it was a little dicey teaching a Japanese healing art as a Japanese descended woman during this time. Hawaii was insulated from the incarceration because and as one government official said, we'd have to incarcerate the whole state, we'd have to put everyone in jail because there were so many people of Japanese descent and of Asian descent. So there were no incarcerations in Hawaii. So there was a little bit of a buffer of safety there, but still quite a bit of pressure to make Reiki accessible and palatable to a US audience. And that led to quite a bit of removal of kind of sanitizing the system, of cloaking the aspects of it that were very blatantly, the system, of course, is built on a foundation of Japanese spiritual practice, primarily Japanese Buddhism and Shinto. And so you have this, practice that significant aspects of what it is and why it is could not be spoken about. And that has led to some very interesting events, including the fact that we still have Reiki, right? Like the tenacity and the creativity and the courage to persist under those circumstances means that we have the opportunity to have Reiki in our lives. And at this point in history, we have the responsibility to understand kind of what happened, and to, do our part to unravel a bit of that harm. And for me, that always begins with knowledge and education and knowing exactly what it is that we're practicing. And so that is where I'm going to pause. That was quite a bit of context, and hopefully kind of sets the scene for the conversation, because where I'd love to go next is, how do we feel about all of that, right? Like, how has any of that impacted the three of us? How do we, navigate that in our own practice, and what might we recommend to others to engage with this as well? And so I'm going to open that question up to my colleagues, and I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Well, Michaela, thank you so much for that detailed context and history. And I think, as people on the path of Reiki, we probably are familiar with some of that history, but, that additional depth of context, I think, is just so important to remember. And, in cultural and spiritual appropriation, one of the antidotes of cultural and spiritual appropriation is appreciation, is acknowledging our history and taking time to really remember the story and put merit into the story, and to, like we were talking about, Hayashi Sensei and Takata Sensei, they're really their struggle, is kind of embedded in the history of Reiki, and a struggle that, ultimately led to Hayashi Sensei's death, and to perhaps a lifelong struggle for Takata Sensei with, running up against systemic racism, societal racism, and oppression that was prevalent for her in her lifetime, and is prevalent for, Japanese descended Americans, really anybody who is has an ethnicity outside of the cultural narrative. And so I love that we're taking a pause and really sitting with this day of remembrance today and speaking to it on this podcast, because I think it is part of that antidote for cultural appropriation. And one of the reasons why this matters to me, and I think it matters, well, first of all, to put the context is, like, I'm a white American woman, and it could be easy, and it probably is easy for me not to see, the racism that runs through different facets of our society, and turn a blind eye to it, and not be able to understand. But I think because I feel aligned around the idea of being a healer, I feel aligned around my empathic nature and my inherent desire to try to see the humanity in any person that I come into contact with, especially those from other cultures. But I just think when I went to Japan, I was really struck with, this is the place where this is the ancestral homeland of Japanese American people. And of course, in our society, there's plenty of Japanese Americans who live in, Colorado, California, these are the main places where I've lived, but, elsewhere. And not just Japanese American descendants, but of course, so many people from China and other different countries in the East. And to me, I think of just this, like, legacy of pioneerism, where they, like, left their homeland and went to America for maybe many different complex reasons. And just the tenacity, the fierceness of taking root in a land that's outside of their homeland, and what it might feel like and be like to go back to Japan, for somebody who has roots in Japan, and what it might feel like to be able to not feel that sense of difference in every day of their life. And so some of my friends who have Asian ancestry, that's just one of the very complex struggles that they faced in their life, is this undercurrent of racism, that's just really prevalent. And from my perspective, it can be hard to see it every day. But when somebody who's Japanese descent or African American descent, this is their lived story. And it kind of brings me to this thought about those wounds that we can't really heal without change in our society and change in the way we treat other people. And so days like the Japanese Day of Remembrance, remembering the atrocities that were done to Japanese citizens and just Japanese people, can be a powerful ally in healing that, and offering that remembrance and that context and perspective. Um, I had a client once who had ancestry from Latin America, and she often described in our healing sessions just the incredible amount of bigotry she faced in her day-to-day living, and the how many times people jump ahead of her in line, people assume that would just do things to put her down, and for that woman, my heart broke because so much of what she was going through was so much bigger than what we were doing together. Healing sessions, it was speaking about these pains and pressures of oppression in society, right? And for healing for her was so complex, it was so multidimensional, it was so ancestral as well. And to me, these are all of the inspirations for why I really put trauma-informed and decolonized principles into my Reiki practice, because we desperately need healing spaces where people can, not be in that narrative and can receive healing and can feel equality and companionship and camaraderie and compassion for the ways in which society treats us. And that also can be for women too, right? I think women, we also experience our own form of systemic injustices in our life, and it's not all men's fault either, right? But and that's why I'll leave it here. But just that I find that healing is such a complex and profound topic, and we think of it as so simple perhaps, but it's really so much bigger than that. And I think that it's helpful to remind ourselves as healers that we do need safe spaces for people with ancestral trauma, with generational trauma, for every soul to feel loved and accepted for who they are. And those little pockets of humanity, as we grow them, they can be such a healing balm for people who struggle with this in their daily life.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, there's a lot in this, and it took me to when I was writing the Japanese art of Reiki and looking for photos for it, and we were looking for a place that we could get some really beautiful sort of Japanese inspired photos, because the name of the book was The Japanese Art of Reiki. And it really was that time for me of trying to express to the world the Japanese origins of the system without pretending to be Japanese or anything like that, but just being able to give a feel of that. And I live outside of Sydney in New South Wales in Australia, and was like, where am I going to find this? So I did a little bit of research, came up with a place called Cowra, which is about 3 hours from here. And there is this beautiful Japanese garden. And this Japanese garden is the largest of its kind in the Western hemisphere. And it's actually a copy of a garden that was built in Japan, in Tokyo during the Edo period. So the period before, we'll say 1600 to mid 1800s. And it has its own history, which I'll tell you in a minute. But the history of this one here in Australia, this beautiful Japanese garden, its history is as a remembrance of the Japanese people who died in Australia and were interned and were prisoners of war. They were POWs, prisoners of wars, in Australia. So it was specifically as a way of connecting with Japan and making some sort of, I don't even think it's necessarily what you would call a reparation, but definitely a reaching out to someone. And so Australians reaching out to the Japanese culture and saying, we have been through things that were terrible, and we're going to create something beautiful out of that. And that's this garden. Yeah. So in fact, that garden, all the Japanese who died during World War II in Australia, their bodies were all moved to that garden. And so it's one, it in its totality is really a remembrance of what happened here in Australia, which, as I said, we don't necessarily think of. Australians don't really recognize the fact that we did intern just Japanese people, but also German people from different countries around the world, Italians, in World War I and World War II. So we had internees, and we also had prisoners of war. So the internees were people who were not, they hadn't necessarily done anything wrong. They just belonged to a specific race. Yep. And so we also have a history of that. Not, as I said, a widely recognized one. Then the actual garden, and I think this is quite interesting that it reflects the garden that was created in Tokyo. That garden was actually created by the shogun of the time, had taken all these families and kidnapped them and held them hostage. So it has a similar sort of feel about it. He held them hostage and he made them create this garden as a map of Japan, and to tell of different things that were happening, information that he wanted, and they created this garden to tell a specific story. So it was actually created originally in Japan by people who were captive, and then in Australia also that was then replicated as a remembrance for people who were captured and held. So that's that story. For me, it's very important, the Japanese roots of the system of Reiki. It's something that has always motivated me in every aspect of my interaction with the system. And it's a weird thing, isn't it? Because, I'm not Japanese. And so it's the wonderful thing that Mikao Usui, when he put the system together, that he said, it's for everyone. Doesn't matter who you are, whether you're a woman, a man, a child, an old person, or what race you belong to. It is something that you can do and practice. And I love that. Hawayo Takada has said that she simplified the system. And as Michaela and Carrie also, explained, there can be various reasons for the simplification. And definitely not discussing its very strong Japanese roots would be part of that simplification. And people wouldn't, there are times where people would never have understood that or wanted to be involved in something like that. I know growing up in the 70s when I was a kid, that, anything from Japanese, there was this very anti-Japanese sentiment in Australia still, And if you think that the end of the war was, 1945. So in the 70s, Australians still had a very strong feeling of anything that was Japanese was talked down, and was certainly not a culture that anyone wanted to be involved with or to show an interest in at that point. Obviously, that's changed over the years, but yeah, I remember growing up with that. And we culturally, what do? We always find a race that is going, this seems to be a human need to put people down, right? And it changes. It'll be one race, and it's another race, and it's another race. And something like the system of Reiki is, as you guys have mentioned, it's an equal playing ground. It's not about race. It's not about how we look. Definitely not about skin color, and definitely not even really about culture. We can learn about the system of Reiki, where it comes from. I love that. I love knowing its roots, and I think that really informs me. And I also find a lot of similarities between, for example, Shintoism and other cultures. I mean, if we look at the history of humankind, we are a nature-based culture, all of us. We all come from nature. And I think Japan has a very strong connection to that. And it's definitely a strong part of the system of Reiki, and that attracts me very much. So, recognizing that, understanding that, knowing where it comes from, bringing that into my own life and comparing it with what I know from my own culture, it's interesting. And as I said, it motivates me. It gives me great joy. And I'm thrilled to be able to be practicing this system that is so open and welcoming to everyone, even though it does come from one specific country and culture.
Yeah. Wow. I loved hearing about that garden, Bronwen. Thank you so much for sharing about that. Just the poetic poignancy of and intentionality of designing it in that way, and connecting that, threading that history of confinement, and then creating a new story about that. I think that's really, really beautiful. And then there's a poignancy for me personally, like in this conversation, because I've shared before that when I started to, when I started practicing the system of Reiki in its Western form, I kind of set aside my, usual perspective around, not wanting to appropriate culture and so on. I just, was very excited about the system. And at a certain point, had this, awareness really come, front of mind, and I couldn't ignore it anymore, that I was, I knew the system came from Japan, but I wasn't being taught anything about what that meant. And I was being taught elements that I knew were not from Japan, but there was no explanation about that. There was no context, and, all of that. And when I really, opened up to, I need to do this differently. Like, is there anybody out there who's teaching about what this practice originally was? Immediately I found your book, like that was like, it just got put in my hand, right, when I was when I became open to the information. And so yeah, there's a tenderness about, just even this friendship, like for me, came from that impulse to come into better integrity with this history. And then, Carrie, what you were sharing about, just about the healing energy of Reiki, and how we can be in relationship with that in this context. For me, Reiki is a healing practice that is about relationship. It's almost like, for me, Reiki heals through relationship, through deepening and repairing our relationship with ourselves, with the world, with the land, with each other, with history. Right. And that's kind of where my mind went, is like, as we repair these relationships with ourselves, with the land, with each other, that repairing relationship with what has come before and what has shaped who we are historically, culturally, has to be a part of that. That doesn't mean that we can undo every wrong that's ever been. Of course we can't. But what are the pieces that are ours to carry? What is it? I can't undo what was done. I wasn't there, and I can't obviously go back in time. But if we look at, well, but what did I inherit? What did I inherit in this life that is mine to control, that I can take action around? Certainly in this microcosm of this conversation, I have inherited a system of practice that I love dearly, but that was handed to me in a form that was almost unrecognizable from its original form. And untangling that unrecognizability, like following those threads back to the origins, matters so much, I think, for each of us, whether or not we choose to practice in that way. I choose, the three of us to varying degrees have chosen to practice as much as we can from those origins, to learn as much as we can from those origins. And, I would guess that the two of you also have experienced that doing that makes us very effective in our practice. There's a certain effectiveness that comes from being in those origins, but then there's also this repair of the relationship between us and the system of practice that is essential. And even if a person doesn't choose to practice that form, many people that I know and people that I've taught have, actually found the Western forms of Reiki to serve them better, to be more aligned with their goals and their worldview and their beliefs and their experiences. And that's fine, right? We should each be in the practice that best serves us. But if those of you listening fall into that category, what I would urge you to consider is the value of understanding the difference between the system of practice that you practice and its original form, and to be able to articulate that and to see the pieces that were blended into the system of Reiki that were from other places. It's an interesting question, Bron, when you said, Reiki, for Reiki, culture doesn't matter. I don't think I would phrase it that way or agree with that. Well, I would be curious to know more about what you mean by that. I think for me, anybody of any culture can practice this practice, but understanding where it came from, if we're going to call something Reiki, which is a word that comes from a culture that has a history, has a particular language, has a particular meaning, then we ought to know what that is. And if we're going to practice something that is completely different from that thing, this is a little bit of a hot take. Okay. I realize this particular piece is a little bit out there, I know, but for me, we maybe should actually call it something different. That if we're going to practice something that is unrecognizable from its original form, then perhaps we're actually not practicing that thing anymore, and maybe it needs a different name. I don't think that's going to happen. I'm not pushing for that, but I do want us to kind of expand our imagination on what does it mean to be in good, right relationship with this practice, and what might that mean? What might be that piece of responsibility that each of us has for that? For holding, whatever piece of that is ours to hold. So I'm, curious for the two of you, what might you advise to folks who might want to, be in a little bit of a more integrous relationship or deepen that relationship, expand that relationship with the system of Reiki as a healing gesture, right? As a form of healing. Repairing that relationship. What comes up for the two of you on how you would recommend people go about that?
Well, I think that the answer is very nuanced, might be very unique to individuals, your own particular history, your own stories related to how you came to be on the land that you're on, and in your own unique connection to Reiki as well. And those things that, like I was talking with somebody recently about chakras and how meaningful chakras were for this person on their in their entry into Reiki. And I feel the same way. Chakras were quite a profound tool to work with in the context of Reiki. yet to understand that they don't come from the same place, and to understand that the Japanese worldview on the subtle body is different than the chakras. Um, for me, it does come back to, at first, like, acknowledgement, right? Is being really clear when we're working with aspects of Reiki that have been potentially spiritually appropriated. um, is to acknowledge where these things came from, and to acknowledge why we might be incorporating them into the context of Reiki as well. Um, but I also think, it's acknowledgement can sometimes be a little trite when, well, first of all, what I love what you said, Michaela, is that, is to remember that we're not responsible for, these atrocities that happened in the past. And there is a tendency to kind of go to a shameful place, or, a feeling of guilt, or, maybe some of our own trauma that we have, no matter what race you are, your own experiences. So it certainly can stir that up for ourselves. So it's important to honor that and work through it as well. But for me, it was an incredible catalyst to change the way I practice, and was in relationship with Reiki, and did invite me into a greater, what I feel is a greater integrity with the practice, although I can't really judge that for anyone else. When I was in Japan, speaking with Japanese Reiki practitioners, one of the things that they said was, if you claim that Reiki comes from any other place than Japan, that they personally found that very offensive. And so that's another, I think, just good line to follow, is to acknowledge that Reiki does come from Japan, and engage in this appreciation for the Japanese culture. Another aspect of this, I think, is unlearning. Unlearning, like you talked about, is kind of really going back to the roots of Reiki, and kind of peeling away the different ways in which Reiki was modified to become what it is today, for whatever reason it was modified, beyond just a cultural appropriation, or um, you know these kind of culturally racist underpinnings. But in that process of unlearning and untangling is this depth of complexity. And in that space, I think these ideas around non-duality are super helpful to recognize, like, yes, these chakras are incredibly useful and can be incredibly powerful for people's healing, and they're in the context of Reiki, and they're merged and married together as if they're one and the same, but they're not. So um, and I think each of us as practitioners has a duty to work with those questions, and figure out how you're going to address them, and acknowledge them in your practice. And in so doing, though, I think the benefit of that is that we get to have more diverse Reiki communities. And if you care about these topics, you can bring Reiki into places that might be deeply impacted by cultural and systemic racism. So, like, recently I got a grant to give Reiki and yoga services to the Yurok tribe, which is the largest Native American tribe in the United States. And it was just really fulfilling to work with that community, and be able to actually earn a decent wage for my time, my energy, my effort, but also being able to work and help people in a marginalized community. And so I think there's lots of potential for some win-wins too when we blend this knowledge into our practice. I'm sure Bronwen has lots of beautiful things to say about this too.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And thank you both for, all the interesting things you have to say. I think you might have misunderstood, Michaela, what I said earlier about cultural stuff, because all I was meaning is that whatever culture we are from, it doesn't matter, we can practice this system. And for example, I was just thinking about that with Carrie. That's beautiful, Carrie, going into, what tribe is that? Because I don't know it. Sorry.
It's Yurok tribe.
Yeah.
Yurok.
Is that EUROC?
It's YUROK.
All right. totally different. Thank you. So the Yurok tribe, but it doesn't mean that. So Carrie's going there with the system of Reiki. It doesn't mean that she has to take on the Yurok tribe's beliefs or understandings, or that they need to take on her beliefs and understandings. But what it does mean is that the system of Reiki is just so adaptable in that sense, I guess, in that it isn't a dogma. It's not something that you have to experience it. You do not have to be Japanese or work from that culture. However, I do think it's incredibly important that that you have an understanding of that. And I think the chakras is a really good example, Carrie, as well. Because what you called a hot take before, Michaela, was something I felt like yelling out at one point when you were saying, but I was controlling. I've learned so much from being on this podcast. I don't call out but I behave myself, right? I'm learning. It's very good. But I was just like, when you're talking about something, I was like, yeah, but why are they calling it Reiki? Because it does seem to me that a lot of the practices that call themselves the system of Reiki are not the system of Reiki. They are something else, and that is totally valid in itself. Why not? Think of it this way: Mikao Usui created this system. Why can't someone else create another system? There's no reason why they can't. And we all influence each other. Things. I'm sure he we know that he had lots of influences in his life, but he called it his own thing. And I think that's way more appropriate than actually taking the appropriation of the name of a system. And I do think it's largely for marketing purposes. And really instead just create your own thing and go for it. Enjoy it. Love it. Yeah. But it's a different thing. So, with like incorporating chakras, it's a different thing. I just I don't see that that it is a part of the system of Reiki. But if people, as Carrie was saying, if people want to do things like that, yeah, then the acknowledgement of that, it almost feels like it's the opposite these days. It's almost like we have to acknowledge that we're doing Japanese stuff rather than stuff, but that we teach from a Japanese perspective. That seems like what we have to acknowledge. It should be the other way around. We shouldn't have to acknowledge that. It is a Japanese practice. Reiki, it's a Japanese word, and Mikao Usui, he's a Japanese guy. Instead, it should be around the other way, and people should be acknowledging if they're teaching something that is outside of the system of Reiki and saying, okay, I practice the system of Reiki and I include da 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 da, if they want to do it that way. Yep. Or they create a whole new system themselves, and that's fantastic and fabulous. I was just thinking about Hawaii Takata talking about the simplification, coming back to that. And, I think there are a lot of reasons for that. And I think, yes, we should be grateful for the fact that she kept the practice going. And there was still a practice in Japan, but yes, definitely not out there. And so her practice, it's a beautiful thing to see that, for example, just about Japan, like Chiyoko Yamaguchi, she passed on what she knew of the system of Reiki that she'd learned from Hayashi and also from her uncle. So, the passing on of information was also happening in Japan. And I sometimes think people forget that there is this very big focus on Hawaii Takata. But for sure, what she taught did get it out into the world. So I'm very thankful for that. In her simplifying things, I think it did leave space for people who could not work in such a simplified form to want to add stuff. And I do think that's where we've gotten so much additional information. And like you guys, I also, I learned, I don't even know what it was, the first thing that I learned. It was a mishmash of stuff. It had Karuna Reiki stuff in it, it had all different sorts of stuff in it. So, all those additions, they are things that I think were brought in because of the simplification of the system. Possibly we need something that is not so simple. Maybe we just, I don't know. I mean, I appreciate understanding the Japanese aspects of the system. I think it informs my practice. It gives me more confidence and wisdom and experience. So that I appreciate. Hawaii Takata was her own self, and she did what she needed to do at that time. So I would like to see, I would still like to see the system of Reiki in its Japanese aspects be more acknowledged, and for it to be the baseline rather than sometimes what it feels like the exception.
Absolutely. I think you're spot on that simplification that was necessary at the time kind of created this like wide open space that then got filled in a lot of ways. And that's, again, we don't have to be, I appreciated, Carrie, that you brought up shame, right? We don't have to be ashamed of that, but we can take responsibility for unraveling that a little bit. And I love the reframing that you're talking about, Bronwen, of making it, the norm that this is a Japanese practice that looks like this. And then if we're going to make alterations to it, to name that specifically. And this is one of those places where language matters so much, right? And even like subtle shifts in language. Like, for example, I ran into a woman recently who, said, I developed a new form of Reiki. It's Celtic Reiki. Okay. You developed a new form of Reiki. It's Celtic Reiki. Well, I didn't have an opportunity to dig into what that meant, but I, having Celtic lineage in my life, I've done a lot of comparison between the Shinto origins, that nature-based origin that you've been talking about, and the nature-based Celtic traditions that are part of my lineage, and that symmetry is so beautiful and it's so rich, right? And it's part of how I can step into the practice of Reiki in a way that feels really alive for me. I would never say I'm practicing Celtic Reiki, right? I would make the distinction that I'm practicing Reiki. It looks like this, and there's these overlaps with certain Celtic practices. And so because there's that symmetry, I can kind of feel the two together, and then name when I'm importing something, which generally it's not whole practices, it's more the mindset that already exists inside of the Shinto origins. And so, I think being careful for about how we name things is really important. And before we, say we've designed a different system of Reiki, let's go back. What actually is Reiki? And what is it that I see the need for, right? What is the thing that I want to bring alongside of Reiki, and why? And then how can I articulate that in a way that, as you said, Bronwen, centers and forwards the origins of Reiki, and then gives clear explanation for what and why we're bringing alongside that if we choose to do it. Just kind of subtle ways that we can center the origins of this practice in a way that really does matter, that is our piece to carry in this. And then, beyond that, being connected with Japanese culture generally, if we're going to choose to work with Reiki, certainly most urban places will have a Japanese cultural center or Buddhist temples, places that you can get involved. A lot of those things are now available online. I study with a Shingon temple in Seattle online. So there's a lot more access to having cultural experiences from people who really want to share them, who want us to be a part of it. Much more accessible now. And then, of course, lots of resources available on learning this history. And we'll put some of those resources in the video description down below for those of you who want to dig a little bit deeper.
I can say one more thing about that. And I know we're kind of coming to conclusion here, but I think where we landed really is super important is you can't just stop here after this talk. If this matters to you, if this is important to you, first of all, it is kind of inappropriate that 3 white women are talking about this. I mean, even though we care about this topic, it's not our lived experience. And so, seeking out Japanese people, having that deeper appreciation for their culture and practice, learning from them, learning from marginalized communities, listening to marginalized voices, and receiving healing, and incorporating healing practices from marginalized communities when it feels appropriate to you. But so that we're not going to continue to perpetuate these kind of white stereotypes and white hierarchies, that has everything to do with this topic. And so I think
I agree. It's very easy. It's very easy, like for me to say, oh, we're all equal in the world of Reiki, right?
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily the case because of other influences and experiences. But for me, that's what it feels like. But that, as you say, Carrie, that is not everybody's experience.
Yeah, totally. And we can be honest about our own experiences, but I think that this is, the steps that we all need to take in order to make our communities more diverse and really create the safety and trust and set the stage so that we can do that well for each other. So.
Hey, I'm going to do a plug for something that I've been doing.
Do it.
Which is just about my WACA 21-day WACA class that I've it's an on-demand class, so you can do it at any time, but it really is about looking at it. It's each day you get an email and it tells you a historical aspect about how poetry was used within the system of Reiki, why it was used, a little bit about the imperial families, the history of that, and lots of resources as you go along to learn more. So I loved putting this together, and it is the idea that though today we may not actually use things like the poetry. I know, Michaela, you've done classes as well with poetry, and that it's very dear to you as well, and possibly Carrie too. I don't know how you work with it. So, it is a part of the system of Reiki, and it's something that in the simplification, it's been taken out. And I think that people think that poetry is not so important today. In fact, we've done podcasts on poetry, haven't we, as well? So, it really is such a beautiful way of contemplating ourselves and the world that we're in, and especially the Japanese waka poetry, because it is about nature and bringing us back into that aspect again. So if you're interested, please pop along to Reiki with Bronwen and join up for that. Anyone else
that sounds
amazing.
amazing.
Like to plug? Go for it, guys.
Well, I'm excited about your.
What was that?
Go ahead.
Talking over each other right now. You go ahead, Michaela.
I was just saying I have a Shoden Reiki 1 class starting March 3rd. That is hybrid online or in-person class. So if somebody wants to dive into first degree Reiki taught very much and as much as I possibly can from its Japanese origins, that is an opening opportunity.
Okay.
So similarly, I have some Reiki courses coming up, but one of the projects that I'm really excited about, it's not out there yet, but is I will be offering a webinar on the roots of Reiki, talking about the history of Reiki from its origins in Japan, and opening it up to anybody to learn more about the history of Japan prior to Western influence, and history of Reiki, I should say, prior to Western influence. So this is another little fire underneath my butt to get it done, but hopefully that'll be coming soon. And I can't wait for your waka thing.
It's out there. You should do it. It really is just such a delight. Anyway, I keep adding to it, to be honest. I shouldn't be saying that, but I keep adding to it because I keep coming across more things. And I think, oh, yeah, that would be great in there. So, there's so much lovely stuff that can really inform your practice. And I think, that's why, take it, guys, whatever you can get, and learn from it, allow it to influence you. And you don't have to be Japanese, but you definitely can get a lot from the similarities and the differences between our cultures. And I don't know what else to say about that. So thank you very much for joining us today. Please like us, click the bell. Apparently you get notifications when we put another podcast out there, and we look forward to seeing you all at the next podcast. So whatever that might be, I'm looking forward to chatting with you guys again as well. So we'll see you all then. Bye for now.
Bye.